War I, Causes and Effects. Since the beginning of recorded history, human beings have accepted war as a routine part of their lives. Conquering armies marched in biblical times. Throughout the days of the Roman Empire, and on into the Middle Ages, and right on into the 20th century, with disputes between nations often flaring into war. America has had its share of military conflicts, beginning with a Revolutionary War against England. But until the beginning of this century, wars between nations were just that. Conflicts waged by one country against another over an issue concerning only those two countries. Then, in 1914, a war broke out in Europe which overshadowed any military conflict in history. It was fought by many nations, devastated vast areas of an entire continent, and left millions dead and maimed. It was the First World War. What caused this mammoth conflict, which many believe would be the war to end all wars? Following the turn of the century, there was instability and unrest throughout Europe. The most important countries, vying for power and wealth, had divided into two groups. England, France, and Russia were united politically and economically against Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Turkey, and Bulgaria. Of these countries, Germany was the most feared. When Austria-Hungary showed its intention of annexing Serbia, a tiny country in the Balkans in southeastern Europe, the Serbians turned to Russia for help. Austria had Germany as its ally, which brought Russia into direct opposition with Germany. The murder of one man caused the entire continent of Europe to explode into war. Archduke Francis Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, was assassinated by a young Serbian nationalist on June 28, 1914. This touched off a chain reaction that rocked the continent. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. When Russia mobilized to help Serbia, Germany declared war on Russia and its ally France. When the German army marched through neutral Belgium to invade France, Great Britain, which had promised protection to Belgium, declared war on Germany and Austria. Italy soon pulled out of its alliance with Germany to join the French and English forces. It was the beginning of a conflict that was to prove more terrible and destructive than anyone could have predicted. The World War was to last nearly 4.5 years and claim the lives of 8 million soldiers and nearly 15 million civilians. The war was actually fought on two fronts. Along the Western Front, Germany battled France and Great Britain. On the Eastern Front, it attempted to conquer Russia and its allies. Most of the German advances in both directions were made in the early months of the war. When it became clear that neither side could advance any further without being driven back, they dug huge trenches in the ground and continued to fight from there. Trench warfare was to become the most characteristic feature of the war. By the end of 1914, there were two unbroken lines of trenches on the Western Front, stretching from the North Sea coast south to Switzerland, a distance of some 400 miles. On the Eastern Front, major Russian advances were repelled by the Germans. The German and Russian armies began fighting trench warfare in Poland. In these muddy trenches, foot soldiers armed with rifles and machine guns spent years fighting one battle after another. In the terrible Battle of Verdun, 900,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. Among the more notable, or notorious, aspects of the war were the new methods invented to bring about the destruction of human life and property. The flamethrower was first used by the Germans in 1916. Modern chemical warfare was born with the introduction of another German innovation, poison gas. Artillery shells filled with chlorine gas were soon being used by both sides. The first tanks were built by the British and used against Germany. They were huge armored vehicles carrying heavy guns and used to break through the German lines and clear the way for advancing infantrymen. The Zeppelin, or dirigible, was a huge cigar-shaped balloon driven by an engine and several propellers. They were used extensively by the Germans to bomb London and other key cities. For the first time, airplanes were used in war. At first, these new inventions were used for scouting, but as their deadlier potential was realized, they were equipped with bombs and machine guns and used for attack. The submarine was not a new invention, but the Germans maximized the destructive power of submarines by arming them with torpedoes and heavy guns. Invisible from the surface, German submarines sank so many ships that Germany came close to winning the war on the strength of this key weapon. Before the submarine came into use, Britain's powerful navy gave her the upper hand in the war at sea. Every neutral ship approaching Germany was stopped by a British warship to prevent food and supplies from reaching that country. The British blockade of German ports soon discouraged neutral countries from attempting to trade with Germany. One of these neutral countries was the United States. President Woodrow Wilson had repeatedly issued proclamations of neutrality and instructed American industry not to carry on any business with the warring countries. But this policy was reversed when American business complained about the loss of potentially great profits. Soon, the American economy was booming as a result of the sale of weapons, food, and raw materials to the Allies. Germany, alarmed by this latest threat, began to use its only real naval power, the submarine. In 1915, German submarines, armed with torpedoes, began sinking merchant ships heading to or from England. It was now the Americans' turn to become angry. Then, on May 7th, 1915, an event occurred which angered the Americans even more. A British pleasure ship, the Lusitania, was attacked without warning by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland. 18 minutes later, the Lusitania had sunk, with 1,260 civilians aboard. 128 of them were Americans. The tide of American public opinion swiftly turned against Germany. Although President Wilson repeated his stand on neutrality, he was rapidly losing support at home. In February 1917, America broke off diplomatic relations with Germany. Within weeks, Germany began sinking American merchant ships. It was becoming clear that America's entry into the war was inevitable. Hopes for peace faded entirely when America intercepted a telegram sent to the Mexican government by the Germans. In it, Germany offered to help Mexico fight a war against America to recover Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany and her allies. American merchant ships and troop transports, now guarded by warships, steamed across the Atlantic carrying food, ammunition, and badly needed troops to the Allies. They were just in time. Russia had become all but useless to the Allies, having lost so many men in battle. In August, Russia signed a peace treaty with Germany, removing itself from the war and giving Germany the use of its remaining troops. America's entry into the war not only provided desperately needed manpower, but boosted the morale of the Allied forces, who were on the verge of defeat. The presence of hundreds of thousands of American troops in Europe helped to turn the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. As each new German offensive was unleashed, it was repelled by the newly bolstered Allied troops. German morale began to sag. In July 1918, German General Ludendorff launched a massive offensive which, he told his troops, would be the final peace offensive. The Allies were temporarily driven back, but their outnumbering of the Germans saved them. An Allied counteroffensive struck the Germans with such force that military discipline broke down and more than 15,000 prisoners were taken in a single day. In October, a revolution broke out in Germany. It was by now clear to the German people that the war could no longer be won, and they wanted to end it. The government appealed to President Wilson for an armistice. The The Germans agreed to negotiate for peace on the basis of a 14-point peace proposal which Wilson put forth. Wilson's proposal did not include any harsh punishment for Germany. On November 6, 1918, the German government sent a delegation to France to surrender. They met with General Foch, the French commander of the Allied forces, and requested an immediate ceasefire. Foch refused. He wanted the war to come to a dramatic end at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, which meant 5 more days of unnecessary bloodshed. On November 11th, the armistice was finally signed. Around the world, people went wild with joy. The war to end all wars was finally over. But at what cost? Throughout Western Europe, cemeteries stand as grim reminders of the millions of young men who lost their lives in what was then referred to as the Great War. The war would not be officially over until a peace treaty was negotiated to formalize the Allied victory. Wilson and other world leaders gathered in Paris in January 1919. Germany was not allowed to attend the conferences. At the conference, America requested nothing of the Germans but a guarantee of peace. The president was not interested in punishment. He felt that everyone involved in the war had already suffered enough. The other leaders did not share his views. They stripped Germany of all her colonies and reduced her armed forces so drastically that she was left with only a token army and navy. The treaty also provided for Allied occupation of Germany at German expense. In addition, Germany was forced to pay reparations to the Allied nations. The amount was later fixed at $33 billion. The Germans were shocked by the harshness of the treaty. They protested that it was cruel and unfair. But as a defeated power, they were forced to accept it. The treaty changed the map of Europe by the formation of 6 new countries: Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It also established the original League of Nations, the first major international association of countries. Its purpose was to resolve conflicts peacefully and help to avert another devastating war. The treaty was signed on June 28, 1919, at Versailles. Woodrow Wilson signed for the United States. However, the United States Senate later refused to ratify the treaty. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles marked the official end of the First World War. But not everyone was optimistic about having achieved a lasting peace. Many shared President Wilson's feeling that the treaty had sown the seeds of resentment in the hearts of the German people, and that German outrage would eventually surface again. They were right. Germany later refused to live up to the conditions of the treaty, and before long, German bitterness led to the formation of the Nazi Party and the rise to power of a man named Adolf Hitler. Afterward, it was said that the Allies won the war, but lost the peace. Within 20 years, a defeated, powerless nation had become the strongest country in Europe, and the stage was set for yet another world conflict.